In May 2021, the fuel simply stopped reaching America's East Coast. Within days, thousands of gas stations ran dry. Drivers lined up for hours and filled bags and buckets in a panic. Prices hit their highest in years. And the cause wasn't a war or a hurricane or a refinery fire. It was a single stolen login and a piece of software demanding a ransom. This is the story of how one hack switched off the fuel to a third of a continent, the $4.4 million ransom that followed, and the strange twist when the FBI quietly clawed most of it back. To understand this, you have to understand what Colonial Pipeline is. Most Americans had never heard the name, and yet it quietly fed their entire daily life. Colonial runs the largest refined fuel pipeline in the United States, about 5,500 miles of pipe carrying gasoline and jet fuel from the refineries of Texas all the way up to the New York area. It supplies a huge share of the fuel for the eastern United States. When it flows, no one thinks about it. It is, like so many of these stories, invisible infrastructure, until the moment it isn't. On May 7th, 2021, a ransomware group calling itself DarkSide got inside Colonial's network. It's worth pausing on who they were. DarkSide wasn't a lone hacker in a basement. It operated more like a business, even renting its ransomware out to other criminals for a cut of the profits. Ransomware had become an industry, with affiliates, support, and a brand. And like any business, it went looking for the easiest, most profitable target it could find. They didn't need anything exotic. Reportedly, they used a single stolen password for remote access. An old account, no longer in active use, with no second layer of protection behind it. Before locking anything, they quietly copied around 100 gigabytes of the company's data to use as extra leverage. Then the ransomware hit the business systems, the computers that handle billing and operations. And here is a crucial detail. The pipeline itself, the physical flow of fuel, wasn't necessarily forced to stop. Colonial chose to shut it down, all of it. Because when you can't trust your own systems and you can't even be sure what's safe, stopping is the only responsible move. They pulled the plug themselves to contain the damage. That decision was correct, and the consequences were still enormous. With the biggest fuel pipeline in the country switched off, the clock started ticking on every gas station it fed. By the fourth day, the shortages were spreading faster than the fuel ever could. In Charlotte, 71% of stations were out. In Washington, D.C., 87% ran dry. As word spread, fear did the rest. People rushed to top off tanks they didn't need to fill, which emptied the remaining stations even faster. At one point, somewhere around 10,600 stations had no fuel at all, and the national average price climbed to its highest level in more than 6 years. A digital break-in had turned into physical queues, on real streets, in a matter of days. And this is the part that should unsettle you. The pipeline could have started flowing again at any moment, but the shortage had taken on a life of its own. Once people believe the fuel is running out, they create the very shortage they fear. Airlines rerouted flights to refuel elsewhere. Hospitals and emergency services started watching their tanks. A single company's bad week had become a regional emergency, driven as much by fear as by the missing fuel itself. So Colonial did what its attackers were counting on. It paid. Within hours of the demand, the company sent the equivalent of about $4.5 million in Bitcoin, 75 coins, in exchange for a tool to unlock its systems. And in a small final insult, the decryption tool the criminals handed over was so slow that Colonial leaned heavily on its own backups to actually recover. They paid the ransom and still had to rescue themselves. But this story has a twist most ransomware stories don't. Investigators had been following the money. About a month later, the Department of Justice announced it had traced the payment across the blockchain and seized most of the coins back, around 84% of them. It was a rare public win against a ransomware crew. And yet, even the victory came with a catch. In the weeks after the payment, the price of Bitcoin had crashed, so the recovered coins were worth only around half of what Colonial had originally paid. Even when you win against these groups, the ledger rarely balances cleanly. The deeper lesson of Colonial isn't really about one password. It's about how fragile the bridge is between the digital world and the physical one. A company can keep the office computers and the machinery that moves fuel on supposedly separate systems, but if an attack on the office side makes you afraid to trust anything, the machinery stops too. The attackers never had to touch a single valve. They only had to make the people running it unsure of what they could trust. That uncertainty was enough to choke a continent's fuel supply. Think about how cheap that was for the attackers, and how expensive it was for everyone else. They likely never set out to cause a fuel crisis. They were chasing a payday, and almost everything else was collateral. That is the unsettling math of modern ransomware. A small group chasing a few $1,000,000 can set off consequences far larger than anything they intended, simply because of how tightly the modern world is wired together. And almost all of it traces back to the unglamorous basics. A remote access account that should have required a second step and didn't. Networks and backups that determined whether days of chaos became weeks. Colonial became a national wake-up call. The moment a government realized that a criminal group chasing a few $1,000,000 could accidentally trigger a fuel crisis across an entire region. It changed how seriously critical infrastructure took cybersecurity, almost overnight. So here's the entry in the ledger. On one side, one stolen login on one old account with one missing layer of protection. On the other side, a 5,500-mile pipeline shut down, thousands of dry gas stations, a panicked region, and a $4.4 million ransom, only part of which was ever recovered. That is the exchange rate when the thing you forgot to protect is also the thing a country runs on. Every hack has a price tag. This one was paid at the pump by millions of people who never knew the account existed. The channel is the breach ledger. We read the receipts, so your company never has to pay one. Put the second lock on every door, especially the ones you've forgotten. And I'll see you in the next case.